Everybody goes on and on about electric cars, but the reality is, pedal power is the future. Oh yeah. Well, hello YouTube, I'm John Cann, and you're probably wondering what's with the little pedal car. So there is a Chamber of Commerce meeting here locally, and the dealership that I work for has got a table at it. And this is meant to be a part of a centerpiece. They're gonna auction these things off, these centerpieces. So they asked me to kind of help out. Got this neat little Ford pedal car deal. And the gist of it is they want it to sit kind of on a pedestal on the table. That way people can kind of look around it and whatnot. And it's not just like taking up the whole table. There's room underneath it and stuff. They also got a little ET doll to sit in it. And it's kind of a Hawaiian luau theme. So he's gonna be dressed up with a Hawaiian shirt and a lei-on. And we've got a surfboard that we're going to engrave, put some flowers and a palm tree on or whatnot. So it should be a pretty cool little project. As far as the pedestal goes, I don't want it to be anything that's, you know, too simple. We've got to make it difficult, of course, because that's the only way you can do something like this. So we're gonna build something out of metal that will sit on the table, support this, and get it up about 2 feet so that you can sit down and look underneath it and see the person across the table from you, have a conversation with them and whatnot. So, here we go.
So I knew how big I wanted the top of the pedestal to be, so I went ahead and made myself a template, because templates are awesome. Basically, I'm just tracing the template onto a piece of sheet metal. This is like 20 gauge steel, nothing real serious. The car doesn't weigh a lot, about 30 pounds, so this whole situation doesn't need to be that strong. Just enough to make sure that the car isn't going to fall down. You know, we'll load test it for a little bit more and make sure that it's sturdy enough, but nothing that's going to be substantial. So of course we're going to use the plasma cutter and cut this square out of there, and then we're going to take it over to a belt sander, and I'm going to use the belt sander to just kind of take the edges off of it and make everything nice and flat. We want this thing to look fairly pretty since it is going to be a centerpiece on a table. Since we've already got this thing on the belt sander, I'm just going to go ahead and take as much of the paint and oxidation off of this piece of steel as I can. It needs to be fairly clean. I'm going to paint it later, and you know, welding needs a nice clean surface as well.
So like I said, we don't want this thing to be very plain. We're going to make something a little special. So this center support really isn't going to do anything. It's just there to give me an idea of how tall this thing's supposed to be. This is right about 2 feet. These little beams are going to be, or this little piece of square tubing is what's going to be the legs. We're actually going to weld them in there to where they cross like this. And that's what we're going to do to make this a little bit different and unique. Of course, that requires us to cut a little bit of an angle to make sure this all matches up when we go to weld it. So that's what we're going to do now.
All I did to figure out the angle for my cut on my legs is basically just hold my steel tube up against the flat piece that I had sitting on that pole. That gave me an idea as to where I needed to cut it. Then I was able to set my chop saw up and just kind of lock it down. That way I could cut each of the legs the exact same. So here's a tip for you. If you want the opposite side of the legs to be flat against the floor instead of having the pointed end of the tube, you basically can just take and flip the tube over and then rotate it 180 degrees and cut it again, and that gives you a nice flat surface to sit on the floor. And now I'm just going to use the grinder to take any burrs or rough edges off the ends of these legs. Now, like I said before, we want this stuff to be pretty clean because we're going to wind up welding everything together, and then we're going to paint it. We don't want to have a lot of corrosion or paint or anything left on this, so I'm just using like a Scotch-Brite pad on my little die grinder to just clean up everything that we've got before we go ahead and start welding. Everything's cleaned up and ready to start welding. So the gist of this pole that I'm going to weld onto this plate is that it's meant to be a support, and this gives us the height that we need for the rest of this pedestal. This thing doesn't need to be welded on there very seriously, so I'm just going to tack it in place, but I want to make sure it's really straight and as true as I can get it. So I'm going to just use this square to set everything up. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so what I've got here is a piece of plywood that I've cut to be the size of the footprint for our pedestal base. This way I can kind of set everything up and have an idea as to how wide and how far out I need these legs to be at the bottom. This will give us a good way to tack this in place and get fairly close to where I want it to be. Now with the legs tacked to the steel plate, we can flip this thing over and put a good weld across the bottom of this thing. Once again, it doesn't have to be real stout, but we do want it to be able to hold this 30-pound car up without any problems.
Okay, so we've got this thing to where it stands on its own using this pillar in the middle. But the idea is to take the pillar out. these legs and the steel aren't gonna hold it by itself. So the reality is we have to brace it somehow. We're gonna remove this thing from here, and we're gonna brace across the middle here with another plate basically, and that's gonna give us the support that we need to hold the table. So I have to make another plate. Now that we have this all in place, I can measure it and see how big it's supposed to be.
What was really neat is that I found with my measurements that I could use the exact same size plate as I had already used. So we repeated the process of tracing our template, cutting out our piece of steel with the plasma cutter, and then sanding it down to make sure we had nice clean edges and everything looked pretty. I cleaned up the steel plate with the sanding pad just like I had everything else. That way it was nice and clean and ready to weld. Then I went ahead and cut the little beam that we'd used to support all this out of the center of our other steel plate. This kind of left everything messy, so I went ahead and used the pad to really sand this down and try to clean everything up and make it look nice as well. Alright, so we want to weld this second plate in here to where it looks parallel to the first one. So what I did is just measured up the legs a couple inches, marked the spot on each of the legs at the same height with a Sharpie. That way I could hold the plate in there and weld it, and everything would come out looking flat. So like every time we go to weld something, we just want to tack this to start. That way if there's a mistake or we have to make an adjustment, we're not cutting a bunch of welds out. We get everything situated and then go back and put some heavy welds on it. Bracing this thing with this extra plate really did the job. It was very stout. I actually sat on this thing to load test it and it held me, so obviously it'll hold the little car pretty easily.
Okay guys, so here's the deal. I've got the stand pretty well put together, and here's the car. Now the trick that we've got to deal with at this point is that the car has to sit up on this stand. The bottom of the car isn't flat. So we've got to build something to set this thing on. You can see underneath there, I mean it's just, you know, got all sorts of different parts and pieces poking out where the pedals are and stuff. So I think what we're going to do is try to focus on those back axles and maybe on this little front piece here. This little guy that goes right here. This little guy there. And see if we can't build something that'll kind of hold this car up on the stand off of those 2 points. See what we can do.
I took a couple measurements off of the car and figured that I could build some brackets that would, you know, kind of span the distance between that front cross member and the rear axles pretty easily with some tube steel that I had. I had built the top of the pedestal with the idea that these would be the points that I would use, so the distance across it was already set up pretty well. So we've got our tubing cut down to size. We're going to clean it up a little bit, make sure that it's ready for paint and for welding and whatnot. I wanted to be able to cap the ends of the square tubing that were used for the brackets. I've got this scrap steel, kind of a chunk of flat steel. Basically what I did is cut it down to fit over the ends of the square tubing, but I left it a little long, and as you'll see later, we're going to make it to where that stands up and acts as kind of a stop to help hold our car in place. That way it doesn't slide off of the pedestal. And of course we got to clean this up so it's ready to weld and paint. The belt sanders work really good for metal that we've cut because it takes the rough edges right off of the stuff. And then we need to just weld those caps on the ends of our steel tubing. The little magnets that I'm using, I got at Harbor Freight. They were cheap, but they work great. I highly recommend picking up a set of them.
Okay, so we've got these brackets built for the car to sit on. The trick to it is the pedals are kind of in the way. They're going to stick down far enough that the brackets won't really work. There's no real flat spot underneath this car because of the way that the pedals work to drive it. So what we're going to want to do is there's a couple little cotter pins in here that basically just hold the pedals to the frame. We're going to pull those out of there and take everything and just kind of push it up in there. That way it's all out of the way. We've got a nice flat surface, well, more or less, to work on. And that way our car can sit on the stand. We don't have to worry so much about it tipping off in there or anything like that. So that's what we're going to do right now. Let's get that set up.
After I pulled the cotter pins out of this thing, I basically just zip tied everything up out of the way. I threw a couple new cotter pins in where I had taken the old ones out. That way, whoever buys this, if they wanted to use it as a pedal car, they are able to just put it back together and the parts are already there.
Okay, that stuff's moved. I've got it zip tied up in there. Gives us a way better spot for these brackets to go. This way everything can sit in there nicely.
With the way that the legs spread out from the pedestal, I had to go back and kind of recess some of the legs where they met up with the top plates. That way everything could sit in there flush and we can get nice welds on all this stuff. So what I'm doing here is getting set up to weld the brackets to the pedestal. I've got the brackets on the concrete floor, that way they're at the same level. This will help us ensure that they're parallel. And then I've got the pedestal sitting up on a couple pieces of wood. This gives us a little bit of space between the top of the brackets and the top of the pedestal. That way if we had anything that was hanging down a little bit under the car, we had room to accommodate it. Once we got the brackets tacked on there, and flip this thing over and put a couple longer welds across the top. The nice thing about putting the welds on the inside on top of this is they're hidden, they're kind of out of sight. That way it looks pretty. Alright, the last thing we're going to do with this, as far as the metalworking goes, is put a couple big washers on the bottom of the legs. This is going to give us a spot to put some little rubber pads later on. That way this thing won't slide or slip when we've got it sitting on the table. And clean up the welds a little bit with the sanding pad and make sure we are ready to paint. I went ahead and washed this whole thing down with solvent and wiped it down with a rag. As you can see, looking at the rag, it was still pretty dirty. Now, even though this is going to be a rattle can paint job, every little bit that you can do on a project like this helps. I shot this first with a white primer. I used the white because I really wanted the colors to pop. If you go with the gray primer, you know, it tends to dull your colors a little bit, which can be cool for certain projects, but that wasn't what I was going for here. Now, since the dealership is a Ford and Toyota dealership, we went with a blue and a red to paint this thing. Blue on the top to kind of match the car, and then faded it out a little bit in the middle, and then went to this nice bright red. Now we just need to let the paint dry and see how this turned out.
Okay, so this thing's had a day and a half to dry. The paint is nice, it's not tacky or anything. So the last thing we're gonna do is take some of these little stick-on rubber feet deals, put them on the bottom, so that way when this is sitting on the table at the dinner, it won't slide around.
These little stick-on pads are something you could buy for furniture. They're available at the local hardware store, pretty easy to come by. They do a good job for this stuff.
Okay, we've got this thing done. We are ready to take it into the dealership and put it all together and let everybody see what we built. Hopefully they like it.
I set this thing up in the break room so that we could check it out. Quite a few of the other employees came to take a look. Lots of positive feedback, lots of compliments, so that was pretty awesome.
Okay, so we were at my work, and the girls were nice enough to let me kind of set this up and mock up to show you what we've got going on. Of course, it's going to sit on the table. They'll have the little gift bags. They were able to come up with some neat little toys to go along with this. And of course, we've got E.T. sitting up in there with his little flower shirt on, his leg. Now the surfboard, we ran this through the CNC laser machine, engraved these flowers, and then put a palm tree on the back of this end of it here. So the surfboard turned out pretty cool. And it sits up on the table, pretty nice. Lots of room for people to look underneath there. You could definitely see the person on the other side and talk to them without this thing being in your way. Turned out pretty good.
This was a nice, easy project to complete. It didn't take too long and the results were pretty awesome. One of the things that's cool about building a pedestal like this is it could easily become a table. Putting a couple pieces of wood on the top, staining them, painting them, you know, making it look pretty. And you could have something totally different. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I appreciate it greatly. If you would do me another huge favor and push the subscribe button, that would be fantastic. And remember, if I can build it, so can you.